Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Welcome to New Brunswick.
Thank you. Could you please describe the development of inclusive education in New Brunswick from your point of view?
Right. Well, the development of inclusive education has been a journey towards a destination, but it's more of a journey over several years. It's not a one-time click, change your policy, change your legislation, make a recommendation, and it happens. It is an ongoing evolution that has happened really since the 50s, the 1960s, the 1970s, 1980s. Like through every decade, there's been advancement. And we are quite advanced, I think, in our policy, in our legislation, and in our practice, but we always have work to do. We're not perfect. There's no education system that is completely perfect, and if we pretend there is, it's a fallacy, because our society changes, our views change, our understanding changes. And in New Brunswick, that's how we've evolved as well.
Okay. Were there particular events or moments that were important for this evolution?
Yes. So in New Brunswick, over the years in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, for instance, inclusive education first started with a recognition that children with disabilities, while they were in separate schools, they had a right to public transportation, to have the school buses to transport. And that was an initial recognition of the rights of students with disabilities. At that same time, really there was no right for students to be educated in our schools. Parents had to fundraise to provide funds in church basements or community halls so that the children with intellectual disabilities would be educated. Then in 1982, Canada adopted a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which said that based on the grounds of people's unique identification, that they have to be treated equally by the government and by society of all aspects of differences and equality to services. So just shortly after that change of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in New Brunswick there was a movement to initiate a court challenge to say that we do not want special education auxiliary classrooms and special schools. We want to be included in the mainstream regular schools. That was very instrumental. As well, families and advocacy organizations like Inclusion New Brunswick, Inclusion Canada, and others, they took the position that they wanted their children in regular schools. The other aspect that happened for us in New Brunswick was that we are a very modest province in terms of our population and in terms of our tax base and our budgets that are available for funding. We have some of the lowest per capita funding of education per student in all of Canada. And so we, at that time, I believe what happened was the governments decided, instead of building up special schools and giving better services in this private special school sector, the government agreed of the day with the parents that we will merge in with the full education, regular education system. And that was a pivotal moment, obviously, with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the government saying, okay, parents saying we want to be in mainstream schools, and government saying, yes, we believe in that, plus we can't really afford any other way.
Okay. What was different here than in other provinces and territories?
A difference, I think, in the 1980s might have been our population. Maybe the disbursement of our population being distributed in a small province, yet still fairly rural and spread out. And secondly, the resources available to the government through our tax base is lower compared to other provinces. The budget for education is one of the lower budgets in the country. In Canada, each province governs education separately. There is no federal initiative at a national level for our provinces. So each province is on their own, basically, for educational funding. And I believe those combinations meant that we really, by choice, by chance, by values, by lack of choice, by lack of chance, by lack, we went to the inclusive system by merging. We didn't have the funds to build separate special schools, where other provinces and other countries at that time, they had funds and they said, oh, the way to address this, and they had the population, the mass of students, they said, we will build more special schools. And I think that was the fork in the road. And for a combination of values, combination of lack of funding, combination of a spread out rural province, and leadership by families and by politicians, we, at that pivotal moment, went towards more inclusive education.
So you were lucky that you were poor?
Something like that. We took advantage of our opportunities of being, yes.
Yeah.
And even today, with our budgets, we still have some of the lower budgets in education in Canada per student. And so when you say, well, you have inclusion and you're all in the same school and you have all these resources, well, it's because we focused the resources on an inclusive system. You start first with your values. And that's what we did in New Brunswick too, really, by and large, as we transitioned the families and individuals and neighbors who got to know who the children and neighbors were, stood forward for inclusive education. And the values are, we believe that everyone should be together. And then from there, then you can find the money, find the practices, make things work, and use what you need to do once you have the values. But it's key to first understand the values of why inclusive education. It is about learning and numbers and math and reading, but inclusive education is also about involving, welcoming, being a team, learning, the things that you can't necessarily put on paper, but it's the intangible learning of values and difference of people and how people relate and helping each other. And that is, I guess, the magic of inclusive education, is how the so-called other children benefit from having difference in their classroom. And then it's about how you want our society to look after school. So when you move from regular public school and you go into post-secondary education, or you go into employment in your community, how do we want the community to look and to be? Well, we want us to be inclusive and diverse and welcoming and most advanced. And you tie that to the research, OECD and European Union and others have researched that a more diverse economy or community corporation leads to higher productivity and higher value. So if you're going to, after school, look at those indicators of diversity, inclusion, bringing everyone up and having a more productive society, then where do you start that? At an early age. And it's a concept that makes sense to a lot of people, but then once you believe in that, how do you go about changing? And that change is very, very hard, very difficult, to change our old systems into a new system. And for people to understand what this means, what you're really looking to do is not to just bring special education into the regular schools and make that fit. What we're actually trying to do is saying neither system is really working for any student. You've got the special education system and you've got the mainstream system, and an inclusive education transformation means we're actually changing both mainstream and special into a new inclusive education system. And it's asking a lot of both systems to recreate and reimagine and consider, and at the same time continue what they're normally doing and transition and change. And in New Brunswick, it has not been easy. It's been very challenging at times to change our mindsets, adjust budgets, adjust training and assessments, and adjust our delivery of education in the classroom by a teacher by the leaders, by education support services. It's a challenge. If you Google New Brunswick education, you will see that not everyone agrees with an inclusive education system. And what I normally will say is if some parents will say, or others around New Brunswick and around the world, they'll say inclusion's not working. And what I say in response is, first, what's happening? And typically, what's happening in that situation is not inclusive education. And if it's not working, it's because it's not inclusive education. We have to fix whatever's happening. So being in a classroom, being placed in a classroom, at the back of the room, a student with an intellectual disability having their back turned with a curtain sometimes, or a one-on-one EA, educational assistant, that's not inclusive education. When a student has to be sat in a desk, in a row, all the time, the whole day, and they need to be active, but they're forced to be there in that position all day, then that is not inclusive education. So if they have a behavior or disruption or want to hit someone, they're trying to express. So yes, there's an issue, but inclusive education is being flexible and adapting to all of the different learning styles in the classroom and being able to come and go sometimes, having different seating arrangements in your classroom. Some classrooms in New Brunswick have beanbag chairs, they have bicycles, seating bicycles, they have stand-up desks, there's some rocking chairs in their classroom. One classroom I know has a swing. And it's really all about a mindset of what are we teaching in this class and how do we teach. And in New Brunswick, we've really gone, in the last 10 years, a lot of work in universal design for learning. For instance, how do we assess what students are learning? Is it always the traditional multiple choice test, and that's how we know whether a student is learning? Or here's an example, in a social studies class, kids are learning about the government and learning about the history of our country, and they have to do a presentation. The old way is that every student has to do a 15-minute presentation in front of all the kids. Well, not every child wants to do that. And some children have anxiety, some children just cannot present in front of their classmates. And before, we used to give a student a 0 when they couldn't present. And now we encourage that the teacher finds multiple ways that a student can choose how they present what they've learned. And to simplify it, you think about in that classroom of social studies, the student is not being tested on how to make a presentation. It's not a media studies or a speaking course. It's a social studies course. So the delivery of showing what you've learned can be any type of delivery, as long as the teacher is satisfied the student has learned what they've learned as an outcome. So that's taken, even that simple example still takes work to explain to teachers, to explain to parents even, to explain to students that, the basic concept of what are we learning, why are we learning it, and how are you going to show that you have learned it can be multiple ways of presenting itself.
Yeah.
It's a simple, but I know it's way more than that, but it's...
Yeah. My dad read my master's thesis back in the days.
Okay.
And he was like, but son, everything then has to change. And I was, yes. That's about it.
And you know what? So we don't like change. Yeah. Public, parents, systems, teachers, it's hard to change. And often in an environment where there's been lots of change, then it's hard to keep changing. And but one thing we've learned is that what doesn't change is change, the need for change, and that change happens. So we have to have, when we do implement change, we have to have proper planning, support, flexibility, and in terms of the opportunities for teachers, existing teachers, to learn what expectations are from a legal and from a policy and from a practical educational learning purpose. And so when we put a change process in place, when I was Minister of Education in 2010 to 2013, we had to invest in the change, which means a dedicated people to help with the change, and also dedicated resources, additional resources in places where we weren't as comfortable with inclusion as we could have been, or where we were compared to other places in our province. We learned that we still had a wide variance of practice. And even though we didn't have special schools in New Brunswick, when I became minister in 2010, we did a little review of where are we? Well, there were a lot of schools that still had segregated classrooms, special classrooms in the school, and they thought, well, there were a lot of classrooms that had students in their classroom but had barriers within the classroom, like a curtain, or the student turned their back in the classroom. So a lot of work around understanding and the existing resources. How were we utilizing the resources? Teacher leaders in the school sometimes were burdened with paperwork instead of helping teachers with their practices in their classroom. So we had to dedicate resources, knowing that there was change, and where the greatest change had to occur, we tried to put more resources, which means more educational assistance, more room to kind of be flexible. And where that additional flexibility or resources couldn't be put in place, sometimes you would see the bubbling up of concerns in the media or whatnot. And so that happens from time to time when the formula is not right with inclusive education. It's funny, for inclusive education in New Brunswick around the world, when people question, they will often have a standard that we have to be perfect in New Brunswick. And I have an example, different countries, they will Google New Brunswick and say, when there was a change being discussed in Ireland, for example, and they were doing lots of work around inclusive practice. They used New Brunswick as a model, but the teachers union were, and others that were not as enamored by the idea, or they were people that ran special schools, would Google New Brunswick and say, oh look, it's not working in New Brunswick, because they found a news story. Well, the thing is, I don't think we should hold New Brunswick or inclusive education to a 100% perfection standard, because we know that no system is. So you're going to find challenges in New Brunswick, but you still start with your values and the ideal, and it's hard to change, but it's possible. And in New Brunswick, it takes sustained leadership, sustained funding, sustained intentional work towards changing to an inclusive, from a special education system and a mainstream system, and merging the two into a new inclusive education system.
But would you say you succeeded to actually transform the mainstream schools into places of learning for all, that are less, okay, everybody sits in a row and listens to the teacher standing in front of the class? Would you say in general this attempt of transforming high schools and also primary schools worked?
Yes, there are many examples in New Brunswick where the schools have transformed the way that they deliver services. Off the top of my head, there's a good dozen that I know that have created these areas of learning where it's flexible, where there's multiple seating arrangements in the classroom, where students with behavioral or autism, they'll be in a class for a particular amount of time, but if their sensory overload increases to a point where they can't function in the classroom, they themselves are taught zones of regulation with their educational assistants. They can leave the classroom and go to different areas of the school. And the schools that are inclusive work to normalize a pullout from the classroom. Every child has something they have to work on, and it doesn't always have to be in the desk, in the classroom, in the row in the regular classroom, but every child needs to be given the opportunity to work on their on the areas that they need to work on. So in New Brunswick, we removed in 2012, 2013, all of the remaining language around special education was removed from our legislation, and we focused on the need for support for students with personalized learning plans. And that can be a whole variety of different types of students that have needs, because we moved away from labels, because students can have multiple labels and they don't fit in one category. Sometimes they cross over multiple types of categories, and sometimes it's day to day it can change. So there's many combinations of what's required, but the key is the leadership of the principal. And as the principals of the school are provided support, and the teachers are provided support in terms of resources, flexibility, coordinated services between multiple ministry of departments in the ministry, between health, public safety, justice, and education, those support services. We have an integrated support system where people and kids can elevate to a regional kind of multi-departmental support process. So there's been some very, very, very good transition in New Brunswick, and I can guarantee more work to be done. Because now as a lawyer, I have transitioned from politics and became a lawyer, and some of my work involves advocating still for students with disability in education in schools. And I still deal with complaints, human rights complaints of not including a student in the classroom, not providing support, partial days, suspensions for behavior or for disability, and without adequate intervention. And so there's still work to be done. There always will be. When we're done putting the work in place, it's when we're not living. So is there always room for learning? Yes, and there's always room to transition and change and to be better as our understanding, education, and awareness changes and the needs of our students change. Our society has become a diverse society to celebrate, and that needs to be reflected and is reflected in our classrooms. And if every child has something unique that they either need to work on or have support for, and if we continue to segregate students based on their needs, then we're going to have individual classrooms for every student, because that's how diverse we are. So we have to take the new society that we have, the changing society, and change the way we support that society in our classroom. And it's beautiful when you see it working. And I guess the motivation and the inspiration is when you see inclusion properly working in a school. You know that it's worth it, the challenge, but you also know that it can work in other schools too.
So, looking from the Ministry of Education perspective, there is a lot that has to change if you say you want to have an inclusive school system, because, for example, regional or statewide assessments, if not every student is learning the same at the same time in the same speed, maybe regional and statewide assessments doesn't make that sense as they used to do.
Right. So the Ministry of Education, like other departments of government, can be very siloed and can actually be very siloed. So you have, when I came in, you'd have assessments, kind of one branch, you'd have curriculum, another branch, you'd have students with disabilities and support services as another branch. And often those branches aren't even talking amongst themselves in the ministry. So when they're not inclusive of each other, then how do you expect the system to be inclusive? And it's very difficult. So what started changing around 2010, 2009, just before I became minister, and as I became minister, we started saying, as a department, how are we all working together for the benefit of each student. And we made a change as part of our transition to more inclusive education in 2012 when we changed the way our department worked and we changed the titles of our support services in the district. So, for example, under curriculum, we would have math and literacy leads or mentors or support. But then people with disabilities were over here called resource. So we changed it around and said so curriculum is curriculum that does the writing of the curriculum, the expectations, the outcomes, and they work, assessments do the assessments, but any intervention, any additional support that's required for the teacher or the student is completed by educational support. And that's based on working with curriculum and working with assessments and combining our work together, but supporting each other. So in the school district, we merged or we combined the literacy leads, the math leads, and the resource inclusion leads together as educational support services for all students, for every teacher in every classroom. So that support service was integrated, so to speak. And what that did as well is there was no more hierarchy of math and literacy being more important than education or than students with disabilities. It's really all of the same thing. Everyone is working to provide more support for the teacher in the classroom and for students with individual needs, whether it's math, literacy, or diversifying the curriculum delivery and assessments. So there were some fundamental psychological or organizational change that occurred so that people with disabilities weren't seen as some add-on. It was an integral part of what we do, because when you think about it, again, a student might have a bit of an intellectual disability, a bit of autism, but they also have a math and literacy need, or vice versa. So that needs to be as integrated. And in our provinces, in most provinces, when you're asking to do more with less money, like most governments, we're trying to be more efficient, then being more inclusive, being more integrated, working together helps be more effective with the dollars that we have as well.
So in your curriculum, students with intellectual difficulties represented in the math curriculum?
Yes.
Inclusively?
Yes. So in New Brunswick, we have one curriculum with a set of standard outcomes, and and that doesn't change. What changes is how the curriculum might be adapted for individual students. So some students get advanced and work ahead, some are behind, but we don't have separate curriculums based on labels. That's very unwieldy and bureaucratic. And again, students have more than one label, so which curriculum would you fall under? So we have one curriculum, as I said, and then we adapt based on the student's needs.
Okay, cool.
And again, that raises questions. Well, how would a teacher in a classroom have 30 different lesson plans, have 30 lessons plans for 30 different students? It's impossible. Well, there's research and universities and teaching colleges, a concept of universal design, and people with way more educational knowledge than me around how to deliver an inclusive classroom curriculum in an inclusive way based on 3 tiers, and but it's possible. So,
yeah. So from your experience, what were important steps in the legislation process when you became Minister of Education?
Well, I and our government was a big believer in involving our stakeholders and partners. I never feel that we can consult too much, but I know the public often feels they're not consulted enough. And so you can get that push-pull. But we had, through the process, 2 senior, Gordon Porter and Angelo Quinn, 2 senior educators with international reputations around their support and knowledge of inclusive education in New Brunswick and around the world. And they developed a team of over 30 administrative leaders, and there were several meetings with parent organizations and teacher organizations and district and departmental officials. And when the report came back, there was a series of recommendations that was required to narrow the divergence of practice. What the people said was, we believe in inclusion in New Brunswick, but there's a wide variance of practice, and you have some very inclusive and still some segregated in our community. And it was important to continue trying to have involvement. We'd have ministerial inclusive education advisory committee that could meet and work through issues. But it has to be ongoing, and you have to continue working with partners and people and understanding. At the same time, when there's a pushback for change, you have to have the leadership and be able to push for change from the top down. And that is not a science, it's an art form of knowing how far to go, being willing to pull back some if you've gone too far, and continuing to push based on the vision and the values. So the vision and the values, if they're there, yes, we would love to have everyone be together. But, and as soon as they say but, we stop. Okay, so we do agree on the values, it would be great, our vision. Then but, well, we don't have resources. It just isn't possible. It takes away from, there's behavior, there's this, there's that. Yet there's usually more reasons why you can't change than there are reasons to change. And then you work through those. You work through those challenges, but you first need the commitment. Yes, the research says more inclusive, diverse classrooms are better. So let's go for what's better. Is it hard? Yes. But we work in partnership with teachers, with parents, and our ministry officials and community partners to say, let's get at it. Let's have short-term goals and let's work towards making those improvements. And we did that and have done that and continue to do that in New Brunswick.
And so you involved the educators and the parents in the process, and then what were your legislative steps?
So for a policy in New Brunswick, the policy would be approved at the ministerial departmental level. For legislative change, then the minister would recommend legislative changes to cabinet, to our premier. We have a premier and a cabinet that are all elected in our house. And then those legislative changes would then be presented in the House, made up of political parties. And then the legislation would be amended, and that legislation was spearheaded through pretty unceremoniously and non-contentious. Ideally, I'd like to think it's because of the groundwork that took place in.
What were the core parts of this policy?
So the major focus in the policy is the change in mindset, the change of presumption. So prior to the policy and changing to a more inclusive system, parents would be placed presumptively sometimes out of the classroom into a special classroom. This is you, this is what you have, this is your label, you're going to be in the rainbow room down the hall. And when parents wanted to be in the regular classroom, they'd have to advocate and fight to get in. And sometimes they just didn't know the difference of what was available. And so what the policy changes and the legislative in New Brunswick does is say the presumption is the classroom for all students, the regular classroom in the community of their neighborhood. And so all schools in our province have a geographic catchment area, and all of the children in that geographic catchment area, geographically, no matter who they are and what they have, go to the neighborhood school. And the presumption is that students in the classroom first, regular classroom first, and support services and differentiation and teaching techniques would be provided by the classroom teacher based on the individual needs of the students. And when that teacher is no longer able to provide the support necessary for that student, then the intervention and support services come to the school, and we might have pull out of that student that comes out into a one-on-one or a three-on-one experience or intervention. So it might be math, it might be literacy, it might be behavior, it could be occupational therapy, physio, and the support services come to the school, and they may rotate around, but the support services come to the school. And in legislation and in policy, that was articulated to say classroom first. If you need to be removed, it has to be justified based on the needs of the student and not based on their label and not based on an assumption. That's a human rights framework. In government services and public services, a human rights violation is when you make an assumption for someone and treat them differently, not based on an actual need or based on an actual, I guess, a need. It's based on the violation is based on an assumption on a label, let's say. So all the kids with intellectual disability goes down the hallway, no matter what. And so that's a violation of human rights. When they go down the hallway, it should be for something that that student needs, for what they legitimately, not what we think sometimes that they need. So it's a challenge. And so that's the biggest aspect of the policy and the legislation is the presumption. And also eliminating any type of resources and the dollar amounts based on diagnosis, because that can often escalate the number of diagnoses, and sometimes people will get more money based on a diagnosis than what they actually need too. So the funding and the resources are based on the needs of the student.
Two questions immediately pop into my head. If you say funding is based on the needs of the students, we have a similar system in Germany for teaching assistants. What it leads to is that people describe their students in the worst terms to show that he or she is able to do nothing, and therefore he or she needs a teaching assistant.
Right. So we require a personalized learning plan when there's additional support services that are requested or recommended. And in that personalized learning plan, ideally it would have a psychological educational assessment that would objectively talk about the strengths and the needs of improvement for the student. And in New Brunswick, we also have a struggle with the amount of resources we can provide to teachers and to parents who sometimes want an educational assistant, and the system has to struggle with how many they can afford and what the true needs are and how to best utilize them. So that's an ongoing, that would continue on an ongoing basis. From a human rights perspective, the system can't just cut an educational assistant in half because they have no money. So it says there has to be a true evaluation and an understanding of what the needs of the student are. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but we try with documentation. Another challenge we have in New Brunswick, like many places, is getting a proper psychological educational assessment. There's the government system is delayed. It's a long wait, and time goes by, and teachers often and parents don't have the proper kind of understanding of what interventions are required. And sometimes parents have to get private psychologists and others to do these reports that take their own money. So that's an issue in New Brunswick. There's a long list of issues. Also, partial day schooling is an issue here too. Sometimes a school will say, no, the student can only come from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock in the morning, and parents have to pick their student up at 10 because they can't manage for a full day. In some cases, that can be a violation of their human rights. There's a guaranteed public education system in place. So often there's still a need for advocacy on an individual family basis and the system basis for parents to still navigate what they should expect in their public education system. And then there's a need for the government to be flexible and also understand that they need to do some things more, but they also can only do so much. So we still live in a world, in a society or in a system where it's a give and take. And ideally we want more give and more inclusive practices. So we have continued strong family advocacy organization, Inclusion New Brunswick, who support families. They also support the education system. They will work to advocate with individual families. They will navigate with that family. They will meet with school officials and help facilitate meetings and understanding. Inclusion New Brunswick provides training for classroom teachers to understand the differences of ways to present in the classroom, the ways to provide support. But they'll also provide advocacy at the departmental ministry level as well, to continue pushing for inclusive practices, because again, it's not something that is a one-time. It has to be ongoing, and every so often it bubbles up the issue into a debate amongst politicians and the public around the support that's provided, but also the question of a policy, and is inclusive education working? And as I always say, it's not whether inclusive education is working or not, it's whether or not we are working inclusive education. So are we supporting it in the proper ways to be able to work? And when we do support inclusive education properly, it's resourced, it's understood, then it works, and that's well worth it because of the value that it provides to society.
Mm-hmm. The other question is, you spoke about the geographically based school areas where all students from one area go to one school.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem we have in Germany with this approach is that our neighborhoods are so diverse regarding socioeconomic status that if you have one school in one neighborhood, it's systematically disadvantaged compared to other schools in other neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah.
And is there a way to address this? Because if inclusive education means all the disadvantaged kids are in one school and have the same resources as the slightly privileged kids in the other school, it doesn't seem to be fair.
Right. And that's a very good question. And another difference with New Brunswick often will be that our communities are not sometimes as large, and maybe by nature can be more inclusive. But there is a city, and there are examples in some couple of our cities where the downtown or certain parts of the city, and we'd have to get some more information about how we address the diversity issue there and the needs. It's a really good question. I don't really have a clear answer for it. I do know that the principal in the school works almost harder to get support from private sector, and the school district can provide, they have some flexibility to provide additional resources, but it's an interesting phenomenon. It is interesting, and so I don't know enough about how. I do know there's similarities in some places based on that social economic. But we did research on that, though, actually, now that we're talking about it, with Doug Wilms. And he's from New Brunswick, he's worked around the world, and he researched in New Brunswick based on postal code, because we had that same kind of question. And actually, there was a diverse, the assessment results didn't all match up to the social economic. We had some poorer communities that actually thrived in their assessments and results. So it does lead to questions of digging down a little deeper. But I know assessments is just one indication, but inclusivity and understanding of values awareness are another. But in terms of the results, we noticed that it wasn't consistently, the results weren't consistent. So then it would lead to more questions of what are those communities in those poorer social economic communities doing? What are the schools doing differently than other schools? What's the difference here? So I don't have an answer is the short answer.
Okay.
But it's interesting.
Yeah.